Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you have decided to gather together to worship on this Sunday. Today is Palm Sunday in the church calendar. And perhaps at the moment it's a more subdued Palm Sunday to what you're used to. Typically, it would be a time of jubilant worship where we might have palm branches in the service and wave our hands singing joyful songs of praise. I remember last year at this time when the children and the youth gathered together and paraded into the sanctuary, waving palm branches, playing on their tambourines, and walking up and down the aisles. And I remember gathering with them and walking with them and doing, perhaps dancing along while singing, and just praising and celebrating. Unfortunately, it's not quite the same experience when we are not able to physically gather together. For us, it may feel like we have lost something because of this lockdown. We may be grieving the loss of togetherness, of celebration, and in our grief we may be asking questions about what this means and how to celebrate at such a time of disruption and upheaval to our normal way of life and faith experience. Last week we reflected on Lazarus' story and read about Jesus weeping with Martha and Mary. Today I would like us to reflect on Jerusalem's story. I know that it is a little bit unorthodox and we've been journeying with people's stories so far, but I think it's interesting to look at Jerusalem's story, in particular as we read about Jesus lamenting, or as the Gospel of Luke records, weeping over Jerusalem. Both these instances indicate the kind of God that we worship. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus, vast, unmeasured, boundless, free, rolling as a mighty ocean in its fullness over me. Jesus' lament in Matthew's Gospel takes place a little while after his entry into Jerusalem, where he expresses, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets and stone the messengers God has sent you. Oh, how many times I wanted to put my arm around you, around all your people, just as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not let me. And so your temple will be abandoned and empty." In Luke, this lament takes place right after Jesus' triumphal entry, saying, "If you only knew today what is needed for peace, but now you cannot see it." He then goes on to say how there will be turmoil, strife, and destruction, and concludes with the reason, because you did not recognize the time when God came to save you. Jerusalem has a long and complicated story, with which I will attempt to be brief. Jerusalem has been a central part of Israel's history and that of the world. This history is jagged, to speak mildly. For Israel, Jerusalem became the symbol of the southern kingdom, the capital city, the home of the king, the center of power in the southern kingdom. It became the central place of worship of Yahweh, where the temple resided, and with it, the belief that it contained the very presence and power of Yahweh. As we read through the Old Testament, we see the oscillating nature of how the kings and the people would stray from faith, following idols and worthless pagan gods, and would then be drawn back to faithfulness through the call of the prophets. They would then stray to empty promises, and then come back, beckoned back to peace with God. And this pattern repeating itself again and again. We can read of several prophets in the Old Testament who brought rebuke against Jerusalem's sinfulness, proclaiming how Jerusalem had abandoned Yahweh in pursuit of its own interests and desires, and the things it thought would bring fulfillment. One author speaks of sin as that which takes away or empties us. It always looks at first as if it were fun and would fill us, but in the end leaves a person unfulfilled, empty, without the hope that it promised. One commentator writes of Jerusalem, "Jerusalem's tragic history had from the very beginning been one long dirge of radiant hopes unrealized, and vast possibilities unfulfilled. What else has it been to this day, except for the cross that one morning stood outside its wall? We hear in Jesus' lament the desire for Jerusalem to turn from its empty pursuits and return to God. Jerusalem appears not to heed the call, and what we witness in the times after Jesus is that Jerusalem continues with its historic, oscillating, and complex existence. Still today there is conflict in Jerusalem. But in the end, Jerusalem is not forgotten nor forsaken. Though the cross outside the walls speak of Jerusalem missing the opportunity to respond to what was needed for peace, the cross, empty as it is also a sign of God's love and the peace which is extended to the whole world, which is extended to us. The question remains, will Jerusalem return to its Savior? And does Jerusalem's story perhaps resemble part of our own stories? The complex nature of being human, the conflict within our souls and perhaps relationships, the oscillating between pursuing our self-interests and keeping our eyes on Jesus. I wonder if at this time of disruption and being overwhelmed by the effect of the coronavirus, I have missed the opportunity and missed the time of salvation, missed those things I have needed for peace, missed that God can be found not only in one particular place, but in every place where hearts turn toward God, where my heart turns toward God. Perhaps the question about the meaning of all that has happened is not as important as the way that we respond to it. Perhaps our celebration is not so much about waving palm branches and singing jubilantly as it is about turning from empty, self-gratifying, self-enhancing things and embracing the person who brings peace, and then with Christ being people who bring peace to our families, our neighborhood, our nation. A peace which is not dependent on the removal of disruption and upheaval, but comes in the midst of it. Do I need to turn toward God, recognizing the salvation and peace which Jesus brings today, at this time, and at every time? Every moment is a moment for turning from things which are empty and make for distraction, and turning to the thing which fills and makes for peace. Jesus Christ, the living water, the bread of life, Prince of Peace, light of the world, God with us. Friends, may you be blessed as we continue to worship God on this Palm Sunday. Amen.